When the British were advocating nationalism, they were advocating protecting their national interest thousands of miles away in Falkland Island. They were advocating their national interest in South China Sea. Whereas when China and countries in Africa are advocating nationalism, we should take it into a completely different sense, that the weak and the small people should have their own protector, should have their own power to defend themselves. Comrades, this is my great pleasure to be here, to be in this panel, joining this event. Myself as a historian or political historians, I'm particularly interested in the history of Afro-Asian solidarity movement and colonialism. So allow me to start with the story of colonialism. In 2018, President Xi Jinping, when meeting with the African leaders in the summit, he stated that China and Africa joined together with a shared experience, with a common value. What I want to say about is the shared experience. There are two layers. Each of them are interconnected. One, the shared experience is colonialism. China and Africa shared experience of being subjected to colonialism. But in the past, the story of colonialism and being subjected to colonialism has always been told in a rather pessimistic tone. A story of suffering and vulnerability, the inability to act upon the reality, the inability to control our own destiny, the inability to have our own subjectivity. This is not true. The common experience of colonialism is true. Before joining Fudan, I worked in the UK in a small town called Exeter for 8 years. It has an intriguing story that connects China and Africa. In the city centre, very close to the campus of University of Exeter, there is a statue of Sir General Reverdy's bull. It's an unknown name to most of the people today, but Sir General Reverdy's bull had a very intriguing history. In 1858, he, after graduated from Eton College, bought a commission in British military and then became a commanding officer in a regiment. Many of us sitting here know what happened in 1858. It's the Second Opium War. So right after he got enlisted, he came to China. He became a war officer fighting against the Chinese in the Second Opium War, which is a war not for territorial control, but a war for capitalist financial expansion. They want to gain more rights, trading rights in interior China, trading rights of free movement of labor, which is a story that comes later, that further connects China and Africa. And then after serving in China in Second Opium War, he went on to North America. He then started a colonial war against the Indians, the bloody Indians, the Red Valley campaign in 1870. After that, he moved to Africa, Ashanti campaign. He was promoted to captain in Ashanti campaign, and then 20 years later, his military career moved all the way up. And 20 years later, he served as an intelligence officer and became promoted to general in Boer War in 1899. The point of that story is, one, colonialism, and particularly imperialism in Lenin's sense, has already been a global force. So therefore, the resistance against the colonialism and imperialism should also be unified and global. And yet, this had not happened. The story of Bull, Reverdy's Bull, tells us that, also gives us an intriguing information about the connection between China and Africa. is that we all know about the scramble of Africa, which all of our speakers mentioned here. The scramble of Africa started with Berlin Conference, and then with start from Congo, and then moving upwards, that European powers divided Africa. But we also know that the scramble of Asia happened relatively in the same time. In 1900, the infamous 8 Nations Alliance invasion of China leads further to the scramble of Asia, and particularly scramble of China, which changed the formal style of colonialism, which predominantly with British as the only leading force in China, gaining all the benefits and rights, moving further into a shared initiative among all, including the old and the newly emerged industrial capitalist powers in Europe. And that began the stage of scramble of Asia, a scramble of China. Those two incidents relatively happened in the same period of time, in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it also leads to the similar situation in China. China, from that moment on, was divided into smaller pieces controlled by warlords. A situation I would dare to say quite similar to what Africa was experiencing, is still experiencing today. It was also in the same period, roughly in the period when Pan-Africanists, people like McCarthy, people like George Padmore, start to advocate the notion of Pan-Africanism. In the 1920s, China was also start to advocate the notion of unification. The new Pan-Asianism, advocated by one of the leading Chinese Communist members in the early age, not the Pan-Asianism advocated by the Japanese imperialists, but the notion of new Pan-Asianism in the sense of equality, socialism, and unification of people. And this is very intriguing. Intriguing in the sense that let us know what is the common value. It seems like deriving from the common experience of resisting and fighting against a common enemy, a global enemy, imperialism, that both continents developed a strong sense of duty, obligation, and the way to imagine a possible alternative future. That future is through unification, and also through socialism. Socialism, not in the sense that one group of people controlling all the resources and controlling all the powers, but socialism in the sense of greater equality for the people, and most importantly, the equal opportunity for development into the bright future and through cooperation. That sense of socialism also has a very solid foundation through the Chinese experience of fighting against imperialism. That goes to the second story I want to share. There is no alternative, right? Nowadays, not only today, but in the early stage of global expansion of imperialism, we see that despite the fact that the imperialism argue for globalization, argue for a non-boundary, they argue against the foundation, the importance of nation states. It is yet undeniable that imperialist force thrived with the support of nation states, the monopolizing of violence. So we can all see that we have Belgium start to colonize Congo, we have Britain, we have the rising powers coming from the European stage, we have, again, Japan later in the early 20th century. All the imperialist forces, they have their own foundation. They have their guns and weapons. And yet, the weak, the small, the oppressed are denied of that opportunity. From very early on, well, at least in my generation, when Thatcher said there is an alternative, we're being exposed to the idea that nation states is evil. State power should be diminished, right? Nationalism is an equivalent of a 19th century English term of jingoism. Nationalism is horrible. But interestingly, one of our speakers mentioned in Nkrumah, his contemporary Premier Zhou Enlai. In 1941, during the peak of anti-Japanese war with China, Zhou Enlai wrote an article published in the Nationalist Journal. It's called "Almighty to the Nation," or "Salute to the Nation, Salute to the State." Right? It's roughly translated as that. I mean, taking that text out of its context, we can say that we can easily make equivalent of Hitler's Nazis' advocation of nationalism.
Yeah.
But no, Zhou Enlai argued, you should see the difference between powers. When the small and weak nations argue for the importance of having their own united, powerful and strong state, it shall not be treated as the same notion of nationalism that those bigger powers were advocating. Because when the British were advocating nationalism, they were advocating invasion of Boers, of South Africa. They were advocating protecting their national interest thousands of miles away in Falkland Island. They were advocating their national interest in South China Sea. Whereas when China and countries in Africa are advocating nationalism, we should take it into a completely different sense, that the weak and the small people should have their own protector, should have their own power to defend themselves. Building a strong state is core to the movement, or to the global movement of creating a more equal and prosperity world, particularly building a strong state of the small and weak. That goes to my final point. That notion of unification and strong states has been and always been on the forefront of the Chinese political arena. On Tiananmen Square, there were two slogans. On the left side of Chairman Mao Zedong is "Long live People's Republic of China." But that's only the story of nationalism. That doesn't end there. On the right hand of Mao Zedong, it says, "Long live the unification of the world's people." The world survive and thrive in unification. And that is the main point I want to convene to my comrades here. Thank you.